The rain falls like a curtain of shattered glass against the stone walls of the palace as Alara pushes through the heavy iron gate, her breath coming in ragged gasps that turn to mist in the freezing air. Behind her lies the only life she has ever known, a life of shadows and silence, and the crushing weight of a crown that chose to destroy her bloodline for a lie. She clutches the leather cylinder to her chest, feeling the rough texture of the parchment that holds the truth of the king's betrayal, a truth he does not even know he committed. Every splash of her boots against the mud feels like a heartbeat of defiance. She is no longer just an invisible Omega archivist, she is a fugitive carrying the ghost of a kingdom in her arms. The forest ahead is dark and unforgiving, but it is better than the golden cage where the man she was fated to love became her greatest executioner. Which country are you listening from? Please comment below. I would love to know how far this story reaches. Alara found refuge in a cavern hidden behind a veil of frozen moss and weeping stone far from the reach of the palace guards. The air inside smelled of damp earth and the ancient silence of the mountains. She sat on the cold floor, her fingers trembling as she pulled the stolen scroll from her tunic. This was her secret, her burden, and her only light. Since she was a child, she had felt the world differently from the other Omegas. While they felt the heat of the sun or the bite of the frost, Alara felt the stories embedded in the objects around her. To her, a chair was not just wood, but the memory of the forest and the sweat of the carpenter. A letter was not just ink, but the breath of the writer and the heartbeat of the recipient. She called it the echoes of the unspoken, a gift that had kept her company in the lonely years after her family was taken. She laid the parchment flat on the stone surface before her and took a deep, steadying breath. She closed her eyes, letting the darkness of the cave swallow her until the only thing that existed was the texture of the paper beneath her palms. Slowly, she allowed her consciousness to flow into her fingertips, reaching for the vibrations of the past. First, there was only a dull hum, a cold resonance of the palace where the document had sat for years. But then she pushed deeper. She searched for the moment the ink had first touched the surface. A faint glow began to emanate from the scroll, a soft, ethereal blue that illuminated the jagged edges of the cavern. The shadows on the walls began to dance and shift, forming shapes that were more real than the stone itself. Alara felt a surge of energy rush through her arms, a warmth that was both terrifying and beautiful. Suddenly, the cave was gone. She was standing in a memory of a room she recognized as the king's private study, but the perspective was strange. She was seeing through the eyes of the parchment itself. She saw a hand reaching out, a hand with a heavy silver signet ring shaped like a snarling wolf. This was the advisor Thorn. She heard the scratching of the quill, the sound like a knife scraping against bone. She heard him chuckle, a low, dry sound that made the hair on her neck stand up. He was whispering to another man whose face remained in the shadows. He said that the king was too blinded by his own sorrow to see the dagger at his throat. He said that by the time the king realized what he had signed, the blood of the innocents would already be cold. Alara felt the malice in his touch, the oily residue of his greed staining the memory. It was nauseating, but she did not pull away. She needed to see more. She shifted her focus, searching for the names written on the decree. Her heart stopped as she saw her father's name written in a hand that was not the king's. Beside it was her mother's name. The memory flickered and changed. Now she was seeing her home, the small house by the river where she had grown up. She saw her father sitting by the hearth, a book in his lap, and a smile on his face as he looked at her mother. The image was so vivid she could almost smell the cinnamon and wood smoke. She could almost hear her mother's laughter. The light from the scroll grew brighter, filling the cave with the radiance of her lost life. Alara reached out, her fingers brushing the phantom image of her father's cheek. She felt a phantom warmth, and for a moment the crushing loneliness of the last few years vanished. She realized then that her gift was not just a way to see the past, it was a way to preserve it. She was the keeper of the only truth that mattered. The council could burn the archives and kill the witnesses, but they could not erase what was etched into the soul of the world. She saw herself in the memory, a small girl with wide eyes and ink-stained fingers, and she realized that even then she had been preparing for this moment. Her power was growing. It was no longer a flicker, but a flame. She saw how the blue light interacted with the darkness of the cave, creating a bridge between what was and what could be. If she could project these memories for others, if she could make the king see what she was seeing, the lie would be shattered. But the realization brought a new wave of fear. A gift this powerful would be seen as a threat. To everyone in power, to the council, she would be a monster to be hunted. To the king, she might be seen as a witch or a manipulator. She pulled her hands back, and the light snapped out, plunging the cave back into absolute blackness. She sat there in the silence, her heart drumming against her ribs. She was no longer just a frightened girl running for her life. She was a woman who held the power of revelation. She was the voice of those who had been silenced by the sword and the pen. She tucked the scroll back into her tunic, feeling its weight against her heart. It was a weapon more dangerous than any blade, and she would have to learn how to wield it without letting it consume her. The wind howled outside the cave, a lonely sound that echoed her own isolation, but as she looked at her hands still glowing faintly with the residue of the vision, she knew she was not alone. Her ancestors were with her. Their truth was her shield. She stood up, her legs shaking, but her resolve hardening like the stone around her. She had a long journey ahead of her, and the hunters would be close behind. She could feel the Alpha King's presence in the distance, a cold, sharp tug on her soul that told her he was already searching for her. Hay would find her eventually, and when he did, she would be ready. She would not hide in the shadows any longer. She would make him look at the ghosts he had created. As she stepped out into the freezing night, a snap of a twig sounded just a few yards away in the thick brush. Solara froze, her breath catching. She was not as alone as she had hoped. Her skin prickled with the sensation of being watched. It was not the cold that made her shiver, but the weight of eyes that knew her name. She gripped the hilt of the small knife she had taken from the kitchens, but her real power was the scroll. She waited for the shadow to move, for the predator to show its face. The silence of the woods was heavy and thick like wool. Every sound was amplified, the trickling water, the rustle of dead leaves, and the frantic thud of her own pulse. She knew that from this moment on her life was no longer her own. She belonged to the truth, and the truth was a demanding master. If she fell here, the kingdom would stay in darkness forever. She could not let that happen. She took a step forward into the moonlight, ready to face whatever was waiting for her in the dark. The memory always begins with the sound of the iron bell ringing from the high tower of the capital, a sound so heavy it felt like it was bruising the very air. Ilara remembers the way the sky looked that day, a pale, sickly yellow, like an old bruise, and the way the wind tasted of ash and salt. She was only 16 then, a girl who believed that the kingdom was a place of justice and that the Alpha King was a god who protected his people. She had been hidden in the shadow of a stone pillar at the edge of the great plaza, her breath coming in short, shallow gasps as she watched the procession. Her father was tall, even with his hands bound in heavy iron manacles, and his shoulders remained straight as if he were still walking the halls of the library he loved so much. Her mother walked beside him, her head held high, her silver hair catching the dim light like a halo of defiance. They were not criminals. They were the keepers of the archives, the ones who understood the history of the pack better than any council member, but they had been accused of treason. Solara could still hear the echoes of the accusations read aloud by Advisor Thorne, a list of lies that sounded like truth when spoken with enough conviction. She looked toward the high dais where King Kalen sat. He looked like a statue carved from the coldest marble of the north. His crown of dark iron seemed to weigh heavy on his brow, and his eyes were voids of shadow, reflecting nothing of the humanity she had imagined was there. He did not look at the condemned. He looked at a point on the horizon as if he were already bored with the blood that was about to be spilled. To Ilara, he was the monster at the center of her world, the one who had the power to stop the madness with a single word, and yet he remained silent. She remembers the moment the sun disappeared behind a cloud and the signal was given. There was no sound from her parents, no screams of terror, only the heavy thud of the platform and the sudden suffocating silence of 1,000 people holding their breath. In that moment, Ilara felt something within her soul snap. It was like a string of a violin being pulled until it shattered, sending a vibration of pure agony through her entire being. She didn't realize then that it was the bond between fated mates trying to bridge the gap between her and the king, only to find a wall of ice. She had felt a connection to him since she was a child. A strange magnetic pull that she had never understood, but as she watched him oversee the destruction of her life, that pull turned into a jagged blade of ice. She had fled the plaza, then disappearing into the labyrinthine alleys of the lower city. Her heart a hollow chamber of grief and rage. She had spent the following years as a ghost in the palace, a servant who was never seen in Omega, who was never heard. She had learned to fear the sound of his voice and the scent of his skin, which always reminded her of the cold morning in the square. This was the trauma that lived in the marrow of her bones, a fear so deep that it was a part of her identity. She had seen the king as an executioner for so long that the idea of him being a victim was almost impossible to process. The memory of her mother's last look, a silent plea for Ilara to stay hidden and stay alive, was the only thing that kept her moving through the dark. Every time she looked at her own hands, she saw the blood of her family, and every time she closed her eyes, she saw the king's cold, unmoving face. This was why she had run. It wasn't just to protect the scrolls or to save her own life. It was to escape the suffocating presence of the man who had stolen her son. She was a woman built on the ruins of a massacre, and her fear was her only shield. But as she sat in the dark of the forest, the weight of the new truth she carried began to shift the foundations of her memory. If he was manipulated, then the monster she had hated was a shadow cast by someone else. The realization was more terrifying than the hatred itself because it meant she had to face him not as a villain, but as a man who was as broken as she was. The wind screamed through the trees again, sounding like the ghosts of the plaza, and Alara pressed her forehead against her knees, trying to drown out the noise. She was caught between a past that wanted to bury her and a future that demanded she return to the heart of the storm. As she sat there, she heard a sound that was not the wind or the rustle of leaves. It was the low, deep vibration of a wolf's howl, a sound that carried the authority of a king and the desperation of a man who had lost his soul. Kalen was close. He was hunting for the girl he had ignored for years, and he was bringing the weight of the crown with him. Alara looked toward the direction of the sound, her eyes wide with a mixture of terror and a strange budding hope she was too afraid to name. The hunter was coming for the prey, but he did not know that the prey was the only one who could save him from the darkness of his own throne. He was the Alpha King, the man who had broken her, and yet the echoes in her mind told her he was the only one who could help her fix the world. Let him come, she thought, her voice a whisper in the dark. Let him face the truth that has been waiting for him in the shadows. The palace of the Northern Reach had always been a place of cold stone and sharper edges, but since the night the archivist disappeared, the air within its walls felt thin, as if the oxygen itself were being slowly drained away. King Kalen stood at the high window of his private solar, watching the gray clouds roll in from the sea like a fleet of ghost ships. He was a man built for war and for the heavy silence of command. Yet for the first time in his reign, he felt a hollow ache in his chest that no victory or decree could fill. He turned away from the window, his boots echoing with a lonely finality. Against the polished obsidian floors, his footsteps led him almost without his conscious will toward the lower levels of the palace, toward the archives where the scent of old paper and dust usually offered a sense of order and history. But as he pushed open the heavy oak doors, he was met with a silence so profound it felt like a physical blow. The room was dark save for the shafts of moonlight cutting through the high, narrow slits in the stone. He walked toward the small mahogany desk in the corner, the place where Alara had sat for years. He had never really looked at her, not truly to him. She had been a shadow among the shelves, a quiet presence that ensured the gears of his kingdom turned without friction. She was the Omega who never complained, the girl who lived in the margins of his life, and yet now that she was gone, her absence was a screaming void. He reached out his hand, hovering over the surface of the desk. He could still smell her. It was a scent that defied the dryness of the archives, a fragrance of crushed lilies, wet stone, and the sharp, clean, metallic tang of fresh ink. It was a scent that tugged at a part of his soul he had tried to bury the day he watched the execution of the traitors. It was the scent of his fated mate. He closed his eyes, a low growl vibrating in his throat as the realization burned through him like liquid fire. He had been living in the same palace as his mate for years, and he had treated her like a ghost. He had allowed the weight of his crown and the poison of his advisors to blind him to the very thing that was meant to save him. The bond was no longer a subtle pull. It was a jagged hook in his heart, dragging him toward the door, toward the wilderness where she had fled. He remembered the way she used to look at him when she thought he wasn't watching. Her eyes had been full of a strange, mournful light, not the fear he saw in others, but a deep and abiding sadness that he had never bothered to understand. He picked up a small charcoal pencil she had left behind, feeling the lingering warmth of her spirit in the wood. Why had she run? He asked. The empty room, his voice a raspy shadow of its usual authority. She had no reason to fear him unless she had seen something she wasn't supposed to see. He felt a sudden prickle of unease at the back of his neck, the same instinct that had saved his life on a dozen battlefields. He was not alone in the archives. He turned slowly, his hand falling to the hilt of his heavy broadsword. The shadows at the far end of the room seemed to thicken and detach themselves from the walls. 3 figures emerged, dressed in the dark leather of the king's own elite guard, but there was something wrong with the way they moved. Their eyes were not fixed on him with loyalty, but with the cold hunger of assassins. He recognized them as men who served under advisor Thornmen. He had trusted with his life. Kalen realized in a flash of chilling clarity that the rot in his court was deeper than he had ever imagined. They weren't there to protect the archives. They were there to ensure the king never found whatever it was the girl had taken. He didn't wait for them to speak. He drew his blade in a single fluid motion, the steel singing a song of death. The first assassin lunged, his movements blurred by alpha speed. But Kalen was the king for a reason. He parried the blow with a force that shattered the man's wrist and followed through with a kick that sent the second attacker crashing into a shelf of ancient ledgers. The room exploded into a chaos of flying paper and splintered wood as the third man joined the fray. Kalen fought with a desperate fury, his mind flashing back to Alara. If these men were here, it meant she was in even greater danger than he had realized. She was out there in the dark, carrying a secret that was worth the life of a king. He felt a sharp sting in his side as a blade found a gap in his armor, but he ignored the pain. His wolf howling for blood, he cleared a path to the door, the weight of his guilt fueling every strike he had to get out. He had to find her not just because she was his mate, but because she was the only one who held the key to the justice he had failed to uphold. He burst through the archive doors, leaving the groaning men behind, and ran toward the stables. His heart was a drum of war and regret. He had spent his life being a king who ruled by the law, but he had forgotten that laws are written by men, and men can be monsters. He swung himself onto his black stallion. The beast, sensing his master's urgency and rearing back with a wild neigh, he would hunt her down across every inch of the continent if he had to. He would find his silent archivist, and he would beg her to tell him the truth. He had been too blind to see the rain began to pour in earnest, now washing the blood from his hands, but the stain on his soul remained. He spurred the horse forward into the night, the scent of lilies and rain guiding him toward the horizon. He was no longer just a king chasing a fugitive. He was a man chasing the only light he had left in a world that was rapidly turning to ash. As he rode, he felt the bond snap tight, a direct line of silver energy connecting his heart to hers. She was alive, and she was afraid. He leaned low over the horse's neck, whispering a promise into the wind that he would find her, and that this time he would not let the shadows take her. He would burn the world down to keep her safe, and he would start with the men who had turned his throne into a den of vipers. The hunt had begun, and the king would not stop until the truth was laid bare at her feet. The village of Oakhaven was a place where the mountains leaned in close as if trying to overhear the secrets of the valley, and it was here in the cradle of stone and mist that Alara had found her sanctuary. It had been 6 months since she fled the palace, 6 months of sleeping on pine needles and washing her face in glacial streams until she reached this cluster of crooked cottages where no one asked for a lineage and no one cared for the politics of the high court in Oakhaven. She was not the invisible archivist or the daughter of traitors. She was simply Alara, the woman with the gentle hands. Who could help you find what was lost? She sat now in her small cabin at the edge of the woods, where the air always smelled of drying lavender and wood smoke. Across from her sat an elderly woman named Martha, whose eyes were clouded with the milky film of age and the deep shadow of grief. Martha had lost her son in the border wars a decade ago, and the memory of his voice had begun to slip away like sand through her fingers. Alara reached out, her movements slow and deliberate, and took the old woman's hands in hers. Martha's skin felt like dry parchment, a texture Alara knew better than any other. She closed her eyes and let her consciousness drift downward into the quiet hum of the earth beneath the floorboards. She searched for the echoes that lived in the marrow of Martha's bones, the small vibrations of love and loss that never truly fade. As Alara touched the hidden gift within her heart, a soft, cerulean light began to bleed from her skin, illuminating the dim corners of the room. The shadows of the hanging herbs danced on the walls, and the air grew thick with a sudden, inexplicable warmth. Alara didn't just see the memory. She invited Martha into it together. They stood in a phantom field of summer wheat and heard the boisterous laughter of a young man with golden hair and a crooked smile. Martha let out a broken sob, but it was a sound of release, not of fresh pain. For a moment, the silence of the village was replaced by the beautiful noise of a life lived and loved. Alara held the vision steady, her own heart aching with the beauty of it. She was no longer a ghost in someone else's story. She was the architect of their peace. As the vision faded and the room returned to its quiet reality, Martha pressed Alara's hands to her cheeks, her face wet with tears. She whispered words of gratitude that Alara tucked into her soul like precious stones. This was the power she had discovered in the wild, the power not to just record history but to heal it. She was becoming the voice for those who had been silenced by time and tragedy. Yet even as she smiled at Martha, a sudden sharp chill raced down Alara's spine. The blue light within her flickered and turned a jagged violet, the color of a coming storm. It was a sensation she had been dreading every day since her escape, a magnetic tug on the center of her chest that felt like a hook made of ice and silver. The bond was screaming, "Kaelin!" She stood up so abruptly that her chair scraped harshly against the stone floor, her breath catching in her throat. She could feel him. He was no longer a distant shadow in the palace or a fading memory of a cold face in a town square. He was a physical presence pressing against the borders of her world. The air in the cabin suddenly tasted of ozone and the sharp metallic scent of northern pines, a scent that belonged only to the Alpha King. He was riding hard, and the fury of his wolf was rolling off him in waves that Alara could feel in the very roots of her teeth. She moved to the window, her hands trembling. As she pulled back the rough linen curtain, the sky over the mountains was bruising, turning a deep and angry purple. Even though it was only midday, the birds had stopped singing, and the village dogs were beginning to howl, their hackles raised at the invisible pressure in the air. She knew that Kaelin was not just searching for a fugitive. He was hunting for the half of his soul he had discarded. He was coming with the weight of his guilt and the fire of his realization. And Alara felt a moment of pure, paralyzing terror. She looked at her hands, the same hands that had just brought peace to an old woman and wondered if they were strong enough to hold back a king. She thought of the scrolls hidden beneath her floorboards, the evidence of the betrayal that had ruined her life, and realized that the time for hiding was over. She had built a life of silence here, a sanctuary of forgotten things, but the king was a force of nature that did not respect boundaries. He would tear this village apart to find her, and he would burn the forest to cinders just to see her face again. She felt the bond tighten, a direct line of fire, connecting her heart to his. As he crested the final ridge overlooking the valley, he was close enough now that she could hear the rhythmic thrum of his horse's hooves in the earth beneath her feet, a sound like the heartbeat of a giant. She turned back to the room, looking at the humble life she had created, the dried flowers, the simple bed, the stack of mending in the corner. It was a world of her own making, and it was about to be shattered. She felt a surge of defiance rise up to meet her fear. She was not the trembling girl from the archives anymore. She was a woman who had walked through the fire of her own grief and come out whole. If he wanted the truth, she would give it. Because to him, but she would not be his victim again. She stepped toward the door, her hand resting on the latch as the first heavy drops of rain began to pelt the roof. The storm was here, and at its center was a king who had forgotten how to be a man. Alara took a deep breath, the air cold and electric in her lungs, and waited for the sound of the world breaking open at her feet. The forest was a cathedral of shadows and damp needles where the light of the dying sun could not penetrate the thick canopy of ancient firs. King Kalen pushed his horse through the undergrowth, his breath a white plume in the freezing air, and his heart a heavy anvil beating against his ribs. He was close. He could feel the magnetic pulse of his mate like a beacon in the dark. But he was not the only predator in these woods. High Advisor Thorn's men had followed him like leeches, tracking the blood of the crown across the frozen landscape. They moved with a silent, practiced efficiency, their blades coated in a dark paralytic toxin that could bring down even the strongest alpha. Alara watched from the crest of a rocky ridge, her body pressed against the cold stone, and her heart hammering a frantic rhythm. She could see the trap being laid. 4 men were positioned in the high branches of the silver oaks, their bows drawn and their eyes fixed on the path where Kalen would emerge. Another 3 were hidden in the tall ferns, their hands resting on the hilts of their daggers. Her mind screamed at her to run, to turn back to the safety of her cabin and let the world burn, but the bond was a tether that would not let her go. She felt Kalen's exhaustion and his desperate hope, and she knew that if he died here, the truth would die with him, and the kingdom would be lost to the vipers forever. She closed her eyes and reached deep into the core of her being, tapping into the well of memories that lived in the very soil of the valley. She didn't just want to see the past, she wanted to manifest it. She felt the blue light begin to hum beneath her skin, a vibration so intense it made her teeth ache. She touched the bark of a nearby tree and poured her will into the woods. She called upon the memory of a great hunt that had taken place in these woods 100 years ago, a time when the forest was alive with the sound of 100 hounds and the thunder of a royal cavalry. The air around the assassins began to ripple and distort like heat rising from a summer road. Suddenly the silence of the woods was shattered by a ghostly sound. The baying of dozens of hounds echoed through the trees, a sound that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. The assassins froze, their heads whipping around as they searched for the source of the noise. Then came the sound of hooves, hundreds of them pounding against the earth, a rhythmic vibration that shook the leaves from the branches. Alara pushed harder, her forehead damp with sweat, as she projected the visual echoes of the ancient hunters. Shimmering, translucent figures began to weave through the trees, riding massive spectral horses with eyes of blue flame. The assassins panicked. They were men of cold steel and political shadows. They were not prepared for the vengeful ghosts of the past. One of the archers lost his footing and fell from the tree with a cry of terror, his bow clattering against the stones. Kalen burst into the clearing, his sword drawn and his eyes wide with disbelief as he saw the phantom army swirling around him. He didn't see Alara, but he felt a sudden shift in the air, the warmth of a presence that was as familiar to him as his own heartbeat. The assassins tried to rally, but the illusions were too overwhelming every time. They swung their blades, they passed through the shimmering mist of a spectral rider, only to be met by another wave of sound and light. Alara watched as Kalen took advantage of the chaos. He moved with the grace of a storm, clearing the path with brutal efficiency. He was a force of nature, his blade a silver arc in the dim light. As he cut through the distraction she had provided, he was fighting for his life, but he was also fighting for her. She could feel his confusion turning into a sharp, focused awareness. He knew this wasn't nature. He knew someone was helping him. As the last of the assassins fled into the deep woods, their cries fading into the distance, the illusions began to crumble. Alara felt a wave of dizziness wash over her, and she leaned her weight against the rock, the blue light receding from her skin like an ebbing tide. She was exhausted, her energy spent, but she had done it. Kalen stood in the center of the clearing, his chest heaving and his sword dripping with the dark mud of the forest floor. He turned his head slowly, his eyes searching the ridges and the shadows. He was looking for her. Alara pulled back, her heart catching in her throat. She wasn't ready to be found, not like this. She wanted to slip away into the trees to remain the ghost. He had always known, but as she turned to leave, a small stone escaped her footing and tumbled down the slope. The sound was like a thunderclap. In the sudden silence of the clearing, Kalen froze his gaze, locking onto the exact spot where she was. Hiding, he didn't speak, but the air between them suddenly felt electric, as if a bolt of lightning were about to strike. The bond snapped tight, a line of fire that connected his soul to hers with a force that nearly brought her to her knees. He took a single step toward the ridge, his voice a low rumble that vibrated through the very ground beneath her feet. "I know you're there," he whispered, and the words were more a plea than a command. "Please do not run from me again." Alara held her breath, her hand pressed against her mouth to stifle a sob of fear and relief. She was a woman of shadows, but the light was finally beginning to find her. The king was no longer the monster of her memories. He was a man standing on the edge of a precipice, and she was the only one who could catch him. But as he began to climb the slope toward her position, a new sound echoed from the direction of the village, a horn blast. Loud and discordant, the council had sent more than just assassins. They had sent a small army to ensure that neither the king nor the archivist would ever return to the capital. Alara looked at Kalen, then back toward the village, her eyes wide with a new and terrifying realization. The sanctuary was gone, and the war for the soul of the kingdom had truly begun. She saw the torches flickering in the distance, like the eyes of 1,000 hungry wolves, and she knew that the time for silence was finally at an end. The air on the ridge was thick with the scent of ozone and the heavy, musk-laden aroma of an alpha king pushed to his absolute limit. Alara didn't move as Kalen crested the final rise, his cloak torn and his silver filigreed armor stained with the dark, loamy blood of the forest. When his eyes finally locked onto hers, the world seemed to tilt on its axis. For years, she had looked at him from the shadows of the archives, seeing only a cold monument of authority. Now, up close, she saw the cracks in the marble. His eyes weren't just the color of a winter sea. They were turbulent, filled with a raw, agonizing recognition that mirrored the ache in her own chest. The bond, which had been a low hum for years, suddenly roared to life, a physical bridge of heat and light connecting their souls. Kalen stopped 5 paces away, his sword still gripped in a white-knuckled hand, his chest heaving. He looked at her not as a fugitive, but as a man who had just found a miracle in the middle of a graveyard. "You," he whispered, the word carrying the weight of 1,000 unspoken apologies. "It was always you." Alara felt the urge to recoil, the memory of her parents' execution flickering like a ghost behind her eyelids. But the truth she carried was a shield that kept her standing. She didn't bow. She didn't tremble. She stood her ground as the wind whipped her hair across her face, her eyes burning with a fire that surprised even her. She told him that he had come a long way to find a girl he had spent a lifetime ignoring. Because she told him that the man who signed the death warrants of her people was not a man she owed any loyalty to. Kalen flinched as if she had struck him with a physical blade. He stepped closer, the heat radiating from him enough to melt the frost on the nearby stones. He dropped his sword, a gesture of total vulnerability that no alpha of his stature should ever make, and held out his hands, palms up. He told her he had been blind, that he had lived in a palace of mirrors and lies, and that he hadn't known the truth until she vanished. "I didn't sign it, Alara," he said, his voice cracking. "I thought I was signing a trade agreement for the northern grain. They gave me wine, they gave me grief, and they gave me a pen. I have lived every day since then wondering why the stars felt like they were going out. It was because I was killing the very world I was meant to protect. It was because I was hurting you." The sincerity in his voice was a physical pressure, but Alara wasn't ready to forgive. She reached into her tunic and pulled out the leather cylinder, the parchment within humming with the residual energy of her power. She told him that sorry didn't bring back the dead, but the truth might save the living. She explained the forgery, the magic she had seen embedded in the ink, and the jagged ruby ring of Advisor Thorn. As she spoke, the blue light of her gift began to pulse, projecting the image of the forgery into the air between them. Kalen watched the spectral scene, the betrayal of his closest counsel, and a low, guttural growl began to build in his throat. It wasn't the sound of a king. It was the sound of a predator who had realized he had been kept in a cage by the very people he thought he led. But their moment of reckoning was cut short. The discordant horn blast from the village echoed again, closer this time, followed by the distant, horrifying sound of a woman's scream and the crackle of flames. Alara's heart plummeted. The council wasn't just coming for her, they were punishing the village of Oakhaven for sheltering her. They were burning the only peace she had ever found. Kalen's expression shifted instantly from grief to a cold, calculating fury. He looked toward the smoke rising over the trees, his wolf rising to the surface, his eyes glowing with an amber intensity. He told her that they had to move, that the council had sent a battalion of the Silent Ones, the elite assassins who answered only to Thorn. "I cannot protect you here, and I cannot save that village alone," Kaelin said, reaching out to her, his hand trembling slightly. "But if we reach the old fortress at the pass, I can call upon the lords who are still loyal to the crown. Give me the truth, Alara. Let me be the shield I was supposed to be." Alara looked at his hand, then at the burning horizon. She realized that the invisible girl from the archives was gone. She was the only one who could prove the king's innocence, and he was the only one with the steel to enforce that truth. The bond flared, a warm gold light wrapping around their wrists like a promise. She didn't take his hand, not yet, but she tucked the scroll back into her tunic and began to run toward the descent, her voice clear and cold. She told him that if they survived the night, she would show him every lie his kingdom was built on, and if he failed her again, she would ensure the memory of his failure was burned into the stars forever. Kaelin followed her, his stride long and powerful, a king finally following the light of his own soul into the heart of the darkness. As they moved through the tangled undergrowth, the forest itself seemed to react to their proximity. The trees groaned and the shadows stretched, caught between the king's raw alpha authority and Alara's ancient, echoing magic. They were no longer two separate people. They were a storm brewing, a combination of power and truth that the council had never anticipated. The hunters were close, the scent of burning thatch and iron clogging the air. But for the first time in 6 years, Alara wasn't running away. She was running toward a war she intended to win. Kaelin stayed at her shoulder, his presence a wall of heat, his every breath a silent vow. The village of Oakhaven was falling, but the foundation of the old world was crumbling even faster. They reached the edge of the woods just as a group of armored men burst from the smoke, their blades leveled. Kaelin didn't hesitate. He lunged forward, a blur of silver and shadow, while Alara raised her hands, the blue light of 1,000 memories beginning to scream from her fingertips. You're listening to this story on the Alpha King Secrets channel. Are you enjoying today's story? Let us know what you think in the comments below. Now, let's get back to the story. The clash of steel against the haunting silence of the assassins was the only sound that pierced the roar of the burning village. The Silent Ones moved like shadows detached from their casters, their movements devoid of the hesitation that usually accompanied mortal men. They did not scream, and they did not falter, as Kaelin met them head-on. The king was a maelstrom of silver armor and feral grace, his heavy broadsword cleaving through the thick smoke with the devastating force of a tidal wave. For every assassin that fell, another stepped forward to take his place, their eyes blank, their souls completely subjugated by Thorn's dark alchemy. Kaelin fought with a desperation he had never known on the battlefield, because this time the war was not for territory or pride, it was for the woman standing behind him, the archivist who held the fragile heart of his kingdom in her trembling hands. Alara did not cower. The fear that had defined her existence for the past 6 years had burned away, replaced by a cold, incandescent rage. She watched the king throw himself into the fray, his body acting as a living shield against the rain of poisoned blades. She could feel the agonizing strain in his muscles through the golden tether of their bond, the sharp sting of minor cuts, and the suffocating weight of his exhaustion. She knew he could not hold them off forever. The Silent Ones were too many, and the air was growing thick with the toxic smoke of Oakhaven's destruction. She raised her hands, her fingers spread wide as if she were trying to catch the falling ash. She closed her eyes and sank her consciousness into the bedrock beneath her boots, bypassing the fresh horror of the burning village to reach the ancient dormant memories of the earth itself. The blue light that erupted from her palms was not gentle. It was a blinding, violent azure that cut through the smoke like a lighthouse beam in a hurricane. Alara screamed, not from fear, but from the sheer physical toll of dragging the past into the present. She weaponized the memories of the land. The ground beneath the assassin's feet began to ripple and crack as spectral vines and ghostly roots burst from the soil, wrapping around their ankles and dragging them down. The air filled with the phantom roars of alpha wolves from centuries past, the ancient guardians of the valley who had died defending this sacred ground. The illusions were so dense, so terrifyingly real, that the Silent Ones broke their perfect formation. They swung their blades at shadows, their cold discipline shattering as Alara flooded their minds with the collective grief and fury of the ancestors. Kaelin used the chaos to his advantage. He moved through the disoriented assassins with lethal precision, his wolf fully in control. The gold light of their mate bond pulsed in time with the blue radiance of Alara's magic, creating a chaotic storm of energy that seemed to push the flames back. When the last of the immediate attackers fell to the dirt, Kaelin did not stop to catch his breath. He turned to Alara, grabbing her by the waist and hoisting her over his shoulder as he whistled sharply for his stallion. The massive black horse emerged from the tree line, its coat singed but its eyes wild and loyal. Kaelin practically threw Alara into the saddle before vaulting up behind her, taking the reins just as a second wave of assassins poured out from the burning remains of the village square. As they galloped away, Alara looked back over Kaelin's broad shoulder. The sight of Oakhaven tore a jagged hole in her soul. The small cabin where she had found peace, the medicinal garden she had tended, the square where she had held the hands of the grieving, all of it was being consumed by a merciless inferno. Through the smoke, she caught a fleeting glimpse of Martha's cottage collapsing inward, a shower of sparks rising into the blackened sky. Tears cut clean lines through the soot on Alara's face. She had thought her magic could save people, but tonight, it had only brought destruction to their doorstep. She turned her face into Kaelin's armored back, her hands gripping the edges of his torn cloak, and let out a broken, silent sob. Kaelin felt her sorrow through the bond as acutely as a knife between his ribs. He spurred the horse faster, driving them toward the treacherous incline of the mountain pass. The storm that had been threatening all evening finally broke, unleashing a torrent of freezing rain that hissed against the hot armor of the king and the smoking earth of the valley. The rain offered a small mercy, masking their scent and washing away the tracks of the horse, but it also made the steep, rocky ascent incredibly dangerous. Kaelin wrapped one arm tightly around Alara's waist, anchoring her against him as the stallion strained against the incline. His voice was a low, rough rumble near her ear, barely audible over the howling wind and the thunder. "I am sorry," he rasped, the words heavy with the ash of the burning village. "I brought this upon them. I brought this upon you." Alara shook her head, though she did not pull away from his warmth. "Thorn brought this," she corrected, her voice brittle but laced with a new hardened resolve. "They were dead the moment they decided to harbor a ghost. But Thorn will pay for every beam that fell tonight. He will pay for my parents, and he will pay for Oakhaven." The king's grip tightened around her, a silent agreement forged in the crucible of their shared tragedy. The air grew thinner and colder as they climbed higher into the jagged peaks, leaving the burning valley far below. The old fortress at the pass, known as the Crow's Nest, was still miles away, a ruined sanctuary that had not been occupied since the time of Kaelin's grandfather. It was a place of ghosts and crumbling stone, but it was defensible, and more importantly, it housed the ancient communication crystals that could reach the northern lords. If they could survive the freezing night and reach the fortress, they could begin to marshal an army to take back the capital. Alara leaned her head against Kaelin's shoulder, the exhaustion finally pulling her into a dark, dreamless void. She was no longer just the keeper of the past. She was the architect of the future. The invisible archivist had died in the flames of Oakhaven, and in her place, a queen forged in fire and memory was beginning to rise. The storm raged around them, a symphony of lightning and wind, but within the small space between the king and his mate, a fragile, unbreakable warmth had finally taken root. The ascent to the Crow's Nest was a grueling battle against the elements. The mountain pass was a narrow, treacherous spine of rock, hammered by a freezing rain that turned every step into a calculated risk. Kaelin's black stallion, a beast bred for the flat, thunderous charges of the plains, proved its legendary lineage by carrying them relentlessly upward. But by the time the jagged, tooth-like battlements of the ancient fortress pierced the gloom of the storm, the horse was trembling with exhaustion, its breaths coming in ragged, steaming gasps. Kaelin himself was not faring much better. Alara could feel a terrifying, icy slowness creeping through the golden tether of their bond. The shallow cuts he had sustained from the silent ones were not merely bleeding. The paralytic toxin was fighting a vicious war against his alpha healing factor. He remained upright purely through a sheer stubborn refusal to fall. When they finally passed under the crumbling stone archway of the fortress courtyard, the howling wind was abruptly cut off, replaced by the heavy, echoing silence of a place forgotten by time. Kaelin slid from the saddle, his boots hitting the flagstones with a heavy thud, his legs nearly buckling beneath him. He grabbed the reins, murmuring soft words of praise to the exhausted stallion before turning to help Alara down. His hands, usually so steady and commanding, shook slightly as he gripped her waist. As her feet touched the ground, a flash of lightning illuminated his face. He was ghastly pale, his lips tinged with a faint bruised violet, and the veins at his neck were stark black against his skin. The poison was winning. Alara's heart hammered against her ribs, but the panic that would have paralyzed her in the past was quickly smothered by a fierce protective instinct. She threw Kaelin's heavy arm over her shoulders, bearing as much of his weight as she could. "We need to get you inside. Now," she commanded, her voice steady and echoing against the courtyard walls. Kaelin offered a weak, self-deprecating smile, his eyes heavy. "I always intended to bring you to a palace, little bird," he rasped, his voice barely a whisper. "Not a tomb." Alara didn't entertain his fatalism. She half-dragged, half-guided the towering king through the heavy iron-reinforced doors of the inner keep. The great hall of the fortress was a cavernous expanse of shadows, smelling of ancient dust and dry rot. Alara eased Kaelin down against the base of a massive stone pillar before frantically searching the room. She found the remnants of old tapestries and splintered wooden benches. Piling the dry timber into the massive hearth, she realized she had no flint. She closed her eyes, reaching for the lingering memory of fire that lived within the stones of the hearth. She channeled her blue energy, coaxing the phantom heat until the dry wood caught with a sudden, violent spark, erupting into a roaring blaze that cast long, dancing shadows across the hall. She rushed back to Kaelin. He was unconscious, his breathing shallow and erratic. She unbuckled his silver filigreed breastplate, tossing the heavy armor aside to reveal the dark, saturated linen of his tunic. The wounds were shallow, but the flesh around them was necrotic, the toxins spreading in venomous spiderwebs toward his heart. Standard medicine would be useless here. Alara pressed her bare hands directly over his chest, closing her eyes and diving deeply into the bond. She bypassed the physical world entirely, projecting her consciousness into the raging storm of Kaelin's bloodstream. The poison felt like jagged shards of black ice tearing through his veins. She couldn't draw it out physically, but she was the keeper of echoes. She gripped the memory of his strength, the pristine, vibrant alpha power that had thrummed through him before the battle, and pulled it forcefully to the surface. "Remember who you are," she whispered fiercely into the quiet hall. Her cerulean magic flared, twisting violently with the golden thread of their mate bond. She pushed the memory of his untainted blood through his veins, using her magic as a spiritual tourniquet to crush the poison. The physical toll on her was immense. Her nose began to bleed, the copper scent mixing with the dust, but she did not let go. She envisioned the black ice melting, overwhelmed by the radiant gold of his true nature. Suddenly, Kaelin's back arched off the floor, a guttural gasp tearing from his throat. The dark veins on his skin rapidly began to recede, fading into angry red scars before sealing entirely under the renewed force of his alpha healing. He collapsed back against the stone, his breathing evening out, deep and steady. He was alive. Alara slumped against the pillar beside him, utterly depleted. She rested her head on her knees, listening to the crackle of the fire and the storm outside, eventually slipping into exhaustion. Sometime later, she felt a heavy, warm cloak settle over her shivering shoulders. She opened her eyes to find Kaelin kneeling beside her. His color had returned, his eyes burning with an intensity that made the firelight seem dim. He didn't speak. He reached out, his calloused thumb gently wiping a smear of soot and dried blood from her cheek. Then, the Alpha King of the North, the man who commanded armies and terrified lords, bowed his head until his forehead rested against the cold stone floor at her feet. It was the ultimate gesture of submission, a swearing of absolute fealty. "My life is yours," he murmured, his voice a rich, resonant vow. "My crown is yours. Tell me who to burn, my queen, and I will reduce this world to ash for you." Alara gently reached out, her fingers tangling in his dark hair, prompting him to rise. "No more ash," she said softly, but her eyes were like chipped steel. "We rebuild, and we start by breaking Thorn's silence." Kaelin nodded, standing up and pulling her to her feet with him. He led her deeper into the fortress, up a spiraling stone staircase that opened into a circular chamber at the highest peak of the keep. In the center of the room sat a massive table carved from a single piece of obsidian embedded with fist-sized translucent crystals. They were dead, clouded with centuries of disuse. "The communication network?" Kaelin explained, resting his hand on the stone. "It requires an alpha's blood to activate, but the magic within them has been dormant since before my grandfather's time. I don't know if they will still hear the call." Alara stepped forward, ignoring the chill of the room. She placed both her hands flat on the obsidian table. The crystals were cold, but beneath the surface, she could feel the faint, desperate echo of the voices they had once carried, commands of war, whispers of alliances, desperate pleas for aid. She didn't need blood to wake them. She had the echoes of the world at her fingertips. She let her power flow into the table. The obsidian drank her blue light, and one by one, the crystals began to hum. The sound was low at first, then built to a vibrating resonance that shook the dust from the rafters. The crystals flared with blinding light, projecting beams of energy that shot through the high windows and vanished into the stormy night sky, reaching out to the dormant receivers in the strongholds of the northern lords. For a moment, there was only the hum of the stones. Then, a voice crackled through the largest crystal, a rough, battle-hardened voice that Kaelin instantly recognized as Lord Vane of the Iron Peaks. "The crow's nest calls," the voice echoed, filled with disbelief. "King Kaelin, is that you? The capital claims you're dead, assassinated by northern rebels." Kalen leaned over the table, his wolf rumbling in his chest, his voice carrying the full, terrifying weight of his authority. I am alive, Vayne, but the capital belongs to traitors. Marshal your banners, call the Winter Guard. The true king is returning, and he is bringing the truth with him. Alara stood beside him, her hands still glowing, anchoring the ancient magic. The war of shadows was over. The rebellion of the light had begun. The dawn did not break over the mountains. It bled through the fog, a pale iron-gray light that illuminated a sight the northern peaks had not witnessed in a generation. Down in the valley, beneath the crow's nest, the earth was shaking. It was a rhythmic, terrifying vibration. The simultaneous march of thousands of armored boots and the heavy, synchronized thrum of war horses. Lord Vayne had kept his word. From the high battlements of the fortress, Alara watched as the banners of the Iron Peaks unrolled against the mist, a sea of dark steel and heavy white furs. Behind them came the archers of the Frostwood, their silver-tipped bows gleaming dully in the morning damp, and the heavy cavalry of the western marshes, their armor caked in the mud of the lowlands. The northern lords had not merely sent scouts, they had emptied their keeps. They had marched through the freezing rain of the night, driven by the resonance of the ancient communication crystals and the undeniable truth that their true king was calling them to war. Kalen stood beside her, his broad shoulders squared against the biting wind. He had discarded his torn, battle-weary cloak for a heavy mantle of black wolf fur, the silver sigil of the royal house fastened at his shoulder. His armor had been scrubbed clean of the assassin's blood, reflecting the cold light of the morning like a mirror. The paleness of the poison was entirely gone, replaced by the fierce, sun-darkened color of a commander who knew exactly what lay ahead. He did not look down at the army. He looked at Alara. They are waiting for the standard, Kalen said, his voice a low, resonant rumble that carried over the howling of the wind. But before we descend, there is something that must be done. The capital must know that we are not coming as rebels. We are coming as the law. He reached into his belt and pulled out a small, heavy iron signet ring, the seal of the Alpha King. The very instrument that Thorn had used to forge the destruction of her life. He held it out to her, his palm open, a gesture of absolute surrender. This belonged to the man who let your family die, Kalen said, his eyes locking onto hers with a piercing, sorrowful intensity. I cannot rewrite the past, Alara, but I can give you the future. Take it. When we enter the palace, you will be the one to seal the warrants for the traitors. You will be the voice of the archives. Alara looked at the heavy iron ring. For years, she had seen that seal as the symbol of her ultimate terror, the brand that had marked her parents as criminals and chased her into the margins of the world. But as she reached out and took it, the iron felt cold and solid in her hand, a tool of justice rather than an instrument of oppression. She did not put it on. Instead, she slipped it into the leather cylinder alongside the forged decree, tucking the evidence safely against her chest. I will hold the seal, she said, her voice clear and carrying the weight of the ancestors who had recorded the history of the pact before them. But I will not hide behind it. We move together, Kalen. The truth is our weapon, but your steel will have to clear the path. A rare, genuine smile broke across the king's rugged features, a sudden warmth that seemed to defy the freezing mountain air. He turned back to the battlements, raising his massive broadsword high into the air. The blade caught the first true ray of sunlight piercing the clouds, sending a blinding flash of silver down into the valley. A collective roar rose from the army below, a sound so massive it shook the loose stones from the fortress walls. The war horns of the Iron Peak sounded, a deep guttural blast that echoed through the ravines, signaling the start of the march. The vanguard began to move, a monstrous serpent of iron and fur winding its way down the mountain pass toward the capital. As they descended the winding stone steps to where the stallion was waiting, Alara felt the mate bond snap tight once more, no longer a jagged blade of ice, but a roaring furnace of shared purpose. She was no longer the invisible Omega who lived in the shadows of books. She was the storm that was about to break over the high court, and beside her rode the man who would help her burn the lies to ash. The hunt for the capital had begun. The march down from the high peaks was a relentless, silent tide. The Northern Army moved with the grim efficiency of men who knew they were marching toward the heart of a rot that had threatened to consume their entire world. The road to the capital, usually a journey of several days, was devoured by the furious pace set by the king's vanguard. As they approached the outer rings of the capital city, the sky darkened once more, a heavy, suffocating gray that felt identical to the day Alara's life had been shattered 6 years ago. But this time, she was not watching from the shadows of a pillar. She rode at the flank of the Alpha King, her presence an undeniable testament to the truth they carried. The outer gates of the capital, usually bustling with merchants and travelers, were barred shut, the heavy iron reinforced timber looming like a barrier between the past and the final reckoning. High on the battlements stood the personal guard of Advisor Thorn, their dark leather armor matching the descriptions of the men who had hunted Alara through the woods and burned Oakhaven to the ground. They did not look like soldiers prepared for a siege. They looked like desperate men trapped in a cage of their own making. Kalen raised his hand, halting the massive host with a single gesture. The sudden silence that fell over the thousands of soldiers was more terrifying than the roar of their march. He rode forward alone, his stallion's hooves clopping heavily against the cobblestones, until he stood within bowshot of the main gate. "Open the gates!" Kalen's voice boomed, amplified by his raw alpha authority, vibrating through the stone walls and causing the soldiers on the battlements to visibly flinch. "I am Kalen, your king. I have returned to purge the court of traitors, and I bring the evidence of the High Council's treason. Lay down your arms, and your lives will be spared. Stand with the vipers, and you will fall with them." A tense, agonizing silence stretched over the plaza outside the gates. For a moment, it seemed as though the guard might mutiny, their loyalty shifting back to the true throne. But before any man could move to lift the heavy iron bars, a figure stepped forward onto the highest parapet. It was Advisor Thorn. He wore his heavy velvet robes of state, but the jagged ruby ring on his finger caught the dim light like a drop of fresh blood. His face was a mask of cold, calculated arrogance. "Do not listen to this pretender." Thorn's voice echoed, carried by a dark magic that mimicked the king's resonance. "The king is dead, murdered by the rebels of the north. This man is an impostor, a wolf wearing the skin of our fallen master to steal the throne. Archery corps, take your aim. Destroy the invaders." The soldiers on the wall hesitated, their bows trembling as they looked between the advisor and the unmistakable figure of the Alpha King below. Thorn's expression turned venomous. He reached into his robes and pulled out a small black vial, crushing it in his fist. A wave of dark, toxic energy rolled off the battlements, a manifestation of the same mind-bending alchemy that had bound the Silent Ones. The eyes of the archers went blank, their individual wills instantly snuffed out as they drew their strings tight, aiming directly at Kalen's chest. Alara felt the danger through the bond before the first arrow could fly. She didn't wait for Kalen's command. She spurred her horse forward, pushing past the front lines of the vanguard until she stood beside him. She raised her hands to the sky, her cerulean magic erupting from her fingertips with a blinding intensity that tore through the gray fog. She did not call upon ghosts this time. She called upon the memories of the city itself. She reached into the stones of the gatehouse, unlocking the echoes of every royal declaration, every true law, and every oath of fealty that had ever been sworn within those walls. The blue light formed a massive shimmering shield of pure history above their heads. When the archers released their strings, a rain of blackened arrows hissed through the air, only to shatter into dust against the radiant barrier of her magic. The northern army let out a roar of defiance at the sight. Kalen turned his head to Alara, his amber eyes glowing with a mixture of pride and lethal intent. "Break the gate," she whispered, her teeth gritted against the strain of holding the shield. Kalen drew his massive broadsword, the steel singing its final song of war. He signaled to the heavy cavalry of the western marshes, who brought forward the massive iron-headed ram. For the true throne, the king roared, throwing himself into the charge. The battle for the capital had begun, and the walls of the old world were about to come crashing down. The heavy iron-headed ram struck the gate with a sound like a clap of thunder, shaking the foundations of the wall. On the parapet, Thorn's face twisted in panic as the structural integrity of his defense began to splinter. Alara maintained her stance, her hands raised high as her cerulean shield absorbed another desperate volley of arrows. The ancient memories embedded in the stones of the capital were fighting alongside them now, the very history of the pack rejecting the puppet master who had tried to rewrite it. Again, Kalen roared, his voice cutting through the din of arrows shattering against Alara's barrier. The heavy cavalry surged forward once more, their muscles straining as they hurled the massive ram against the weakening timber. With a deafening crack, the primary support beams of the outer gate snapped, and the reinforced doors groaned inward, throwing up a cloud of splintered wood and ancient dust. The northern vanguard poured through the breach like an angry sea breaking through a dike. Kalen led the charge, a whirlwind of silver and fur, clearing a path through the mind-controlled guards with non-lethal, calculated strikes. He was not there to slaughter his own people. He was there to sever the head of the snake. Alara followed closely behind him, protected by a phalanx of Lord Vane's elite shield-bearers, her eyes fixed on the high palace stairs where Thorn had already turned to flee into the interior. The battle moved rapidly from the gates into the Grand Plaza, the very place where Alara had watched her parents die. The yellow sky of her memory was replaced by the flashing blue and gold of the rebellion. As she stepped onto the stones, she felt the phantom weight of her 16-year-old self watching from the pillars. But the ghost was finally laid to rest. She was no longer a witness. She was the judge. Thorne's remaining loyalists attempted to form a final defensive line at the base of the palace steps, but they were utterly overwhelmed by the sheer force of the Northern Lords. Kalen cut through the center of their line, his boots taking the grand stairs 3 at a time, until he burst through the heavy oak doors of the throne room, with Alara right at his shoulder. The grand chamber was bathed in a suffocating dim light. Thorne stood at the foot of the dark iron throne, his breathing ragged, his hands trembling as he attempted to ignite a final desperate spell from his ruby ring. "Stand down, Thorne," Kalen commanded, his broadsword leveled at the advisor's throat. The alpha aura rolling off the king was so dense it practically forced the air from the room, pressing Thorne down to his knees by sheer biological authority. "The lords have turned. Your guards are disarmed. Your silence is broken." Thorne looked up, his eyes wide with the frantic rage of a cornered beast. He didn't look at Kalen, he looked at Alara. "You," he hissed, his voice spitting venom. "The little archivist, you should have died with the rest of the rats in the cellar." Alara stepped forward, her movements entirely devoid of fear. She reached into her tunic and pulled out the leather cylinder, sliding the forged decree into the light. With a flick of her wrist, her blue magic washed over the parchment, projecting the glowing, jagged visage of Thorne's ruby ring into the air for every entering lord to see. "The archives do not forget, advisor," Alara said, her voice echoing with the clarity of a bell. "And they do not lie." She reached into the cylinder once more and pulled out the iron signet ring Kalen had given her on the mountaintop. Walking past the king, she stood directly over the kneeling traitor. She pressed the heavy iron seal against the bottom of the forgery, her blue light flaring one last time to permanently bind the true record of his treason to the magic of the kingdom. "By the law of the true throne," Alara declared, looking down at the man who had stolen her family, "your name is struck from the history of this pack. You will be remembered only as the shadow that failed." Kalen stepped forward, signaling the guards to drag the broken advisor away to the dungeons. The throne room fell into a profound, clean silence, the heavy air finally lifting as the dark alchemy dissipated from the palace walls. The Northern Lords filed into the chamber, their weapons lowered, their heads bowing in deep reverence to the true king standing before the Iron Throne. But Kalen did not ascend the steps. He turned to Alara, extending his hand to her in front of the entire assembly. The mate bond between them was no longer a chaotic storm or a quiet ache. It was a steady, radiant hearth that illuminated the entire room. "The capital is saved," Kalen said, his voice rich and steady, ensuring every lord heard the vow. "But a kingdom cannot be ruled by steel alone. It must be guided by the truth." Alara looked at his hand, then at the assembled lords, and finally at the open windows where the pale sun was finally breaking through the gray fog, bathing the city in a clean golden light. She took his hand, her fingers locking with his, stepping up to the dais, not as a servant and not as a ghost, but as the queen who had rewritten the fate of the North. The first dawn following the liberation of the capital did not bring immediate peace. Instead, it exposed a battlefield cluttered with the debris of a collapsed old order. High Advisor Thorne had been cast into the dungeons, but his corruption and manipulation over the past 6 years had taken root deep within the political machinery of the Northern Reach. King Kalen sat upon the Iron Throne, his rugged features etched with exhaustion, yet his amber eyes remained sharp and piercing. He looked down at the grand hall where the High Lords were locked in a fierce, chaotic debate. They no longer feared the crown's raw power, they doubted its legitimacy. The sudden emergence of Alara, an Omega, who had been an invisible, nameless servant in the archives, now holding the royal signet ring and standing as an equal to the Alpha King, had ignited a silent conservative rebellion among the nobility. Alara stood beside the throne, her dark green cloak embroidered with the ancient silver motifs of the archivist lineage. She did not look at the lords. Her gaze was fixed on the obsidian table before her, where ledger after ledger confiscated from Thorne's private estate lay piled. Her strength was not found in the weight of steel, but in the power of the written word. She could feel the lingering traces of dark magic, the subtle mind-bending compliance spells still clinging to the parchment. Thorne had not acted alone. He possessed a vast network of conspirators hidden right within the ranks of the lords, currently proclaiming their absolute loyalty to the crown. "Your Majesty," Lord Joshua of the Western Marshes stepped forward, his voice booming and laced with open defiance. "We are loyal to your bloodline. But this kingdom cannot be led by a ghost from the shadows, an Omega who bears the surname of executed traitors. How can we be certain that the memories she manifests are not a form of heresy, a dark illusion meant to deceive us all?" A murmur of agreement rippled through the assembled nobility. Kaelin's hand tightened around the iron armrest of his throne. A low, territorial growl vibrated from his chest, unleashing a wave of suffocating alpha pressure that instantly weighed down on the shoulders of every man in the room. "Joshua," Kaelin said, his voice as cold and unyielding as winter ice. "Are you daring to challenge the woman who saved my life, saved this capital, and stands as my fated mate?" "I would never challenge the crown, sire," Joshua replied, bowing his head slightly, though his eyes remained defiant. "But the ancient laws of the pact dictate that a queen must prove her strength to protect the realm, not merely rely on scrap paper and a strange blue light." Elara placed her hand gently over Kaelin's clenched fist. Her touch acted like a cool spring, instantly quelling the volatile fire of his alpha rage. She stepped forward on the dais, facing Joshua directly. The timidity of the girl who once lived in the margins was completely gone. Her eyes burned with the deep, iridescent cerulean of ancient history and absolute truth. She stated that the ancient laws also dictated that any traitor who withheld the truth to profit from the blood of the pack would be burned alive. She snapped open Thorn's personal ledger and channeled her power into the bindings. A brilliant column of blue light erupted from the pages, projecting a vivid, moving memory into the air above the hall. It was the unmistakable image of Lord Joshua himself, 3 winters ago, secretly accepting chests of gold from Thorn in exchange for cutting off emergency grain shipments to the northern border. A betrayal that had left thousands of Omegas and children to starve in the freezing dark. Joshua's cruel laughter and greedy negotiation echoed clearly through the silent throne room, leaving no room for denial. The Lord's face drained of color instantly. He fell to his knees on the polished obsidian floor, trembling under the disgusted and furious glares of his peers. "The memory of the earth does not lie, Lord Joshua," Elara said, her voice calm but ringing with the absolute authority of a high judge. "And the keeper of those memories will never allow men like you to poison this court again." Kaelin stood up, drawing his massive broadsword and pointing it directly at the trembling nobleman. He ordered the royal guard to strip Joshua of his titles and drag him to the dungeons alongside Thorn. A profound, terrified silence fell over the grand hall. Those who had harbored thoughts of opposing Elara now bowed their heads low, realizing that the woman standing beside the king was not a fragile Omega to be managed, but a formidable force capable of stripping away their deepest, darkest secrets. When the lords finally withdrew to prepare for the reconstruction councils, the cavernous throne room was left to Kaelin and Elara alone. Kaelin stepped toward her, unfastening the heavy iron crown from his head and placing it carelessly on the obsidian table. He looked at her, his eyes filled with a profound reverence and a fierce devotion he had never imagined himself capable of feeling. He admitted that without her, he would have remained a blind tyrant forever surrounded by gilded lies. Elara offered a faint, weary smile, but the toll of her magic was beginning to show in the dark circles beneath her eyes. Forcing inanimate objects to yield their hidden history demanded a massive amount of her life force. "This is only the beginning, Kaelin," she whispered, leaning her head against his warm, armored chest. "Thorn's network is vast. Joshua was just a minor cog in the machine. Thorn hid something at the southern border, a relic of dark alchemy capable of suppressing even the strongest alpha wolves. That is why your elite warriors fell under his control so easily." Kaelin wrapped his arms tightly around her, his rich scent of cedarwood enveloping her like an unbreakable shield. He vowed that no matter what Thorn had hidden, they would find it and reduce it to ash together. But first, they needed to secure the capital and prepare for the most vital event of their reign, the mate bonding ceremony before the entire population, establishing Elara as the true and sovereign queen of the North. Yet their brief moment of solace was shattered as a sharp, agonizing shriek pierced the air. A royal messenger falcon crashed through the high stained glass window, its feathers matted with black blood and a terrifyingly familiar toxin. The bird collapsed onto the stone floor, gasping its last breath. Attached to its talon was a single strip of parchment, bearing a message written in frantic, drying blood. "The Dark Lord of the South has awakened. The capital will fall." The ride back to the capital was a race against the time that seemed to be actively rotting around them. Though the southern rift had been cleansed, the shockwave of that spiritual purification had shattered the fragile equilibrium of the entire realm. As Elara and Kaelin breached the city's outer perimeter, they found the capital gripped not by the chaos of a traditional siege, but by a terrifying frozen stillness. A dense, unnatural fog, gray as ash and smelling heavily of sulfur and stagnant water, had swallowed the streets. The citizens were not running or crying out. They stood in the thoroughfares like hollow statues, their eyes clouded with the same milky film of obedience that had marked the silent ones. Thorn's contingency plan had activated the moment the southern ritual concluded, drawing upon the residual dark alchemy embedded in the city's foundations to paralyze the populace. Kalen dismounted in the Grand Plaza, his broadsword drawn, his kinetic alpha energy radiating in desperate, sweeping waves to push back the encroaching mist. But the fog was dense, pressing against his golden aura like a physical weight, threatening to suffocate his wolf. "They aren't dead," Kalen muttered, his voice strained as he checked the pulse of a nearby baker who stood frozen mid-stride. "But their spirits are being drained. Thorn is pulling their life forces into the palace. He's feeding on them." Alara closed her eyes, her newly awakened nature as the sovereign of memories, allowing her to perceive the invisible threads of energy connecting every paralyzed citizen to the high spires of the royal keep. The permanent iridescent sheen on her skin pulsed in rhythm with the fading heartbeats of the people. She told Kalen that they could not cut these threads with steel. To do so would instantly sever the souls of the innocent from their bodies. The dark alchemy had to be dismantled from the source. The high altar within the palace sanctuary where Thorn had spent decades weaving his web of compliance. They ran through the silent, ghostly corridors of the palace, their footsteps echoing with a hollow finality. The royal guards who had previously surrendered were now part of the frozen army, their weapons raised in static defiance. When they finally burst through the heavy bronze doors of the inner sanctuary, they found Advisor Thorn waiting for them. He was no longer the frail, aging man who had knelt in the throne room. The dark energy he had siphoned from the city had bloated his form, his veins black and visible beneath his velvet robes, his eyes completely consumed by a void of absolute darkness. Beside him, the high altar was engulfed in a swirling vortex of violet flame, feeding on the stolen memories and vitality of the capital. "You are too late, little bird," Thorn hissed, his voice a discordant chorus of 1,000 stolen souls that made the stone walls vibrate. "You cleansed the south, but you left the heart of the vipers intact. With the life force of this city, I will ascend beyond the limitations of an alpha, beyond the laws of your pathetic pack. I will become the history of this world." Kalen didn't waste breath on words. He lunged forward, his movements a blur of pure, lethal speed, his broadsword coming down in a vertical arc meant to cleave the traitor in two. But Thorn merely raised a hand, a shockwave of dark compressed energy erupting from his fingers and slamming into Kalen's chest. The impact sent the Alpha King crashing across the sanctuary floor, his silver armor cracking against the stone pillars. Kalen coughed up dark blood, the sheer force of the blow temporarily paralyzing his legs as the black alchemy fought his healing factor. Thorn laughed, turning his gaze toward Alara. "And you, the keeper of ghosts, let us see how much weight your little library can carry." He gestured toward the vortex, and 3 monstrous figures materialized from the violet flames, spectral manifestations of Alara's own executed parents, their faces twisted into masks of agonizing hatred, their voices screaming accusations at her for surviving while they rotted in the earth. The sight threatened to tear Alara's soul apart. The old guilt, the paralyzing terror of her 16-year-old self, flared up like a fresh wound. But she looked at Kalen, who was forcing himself back to his feet through sheer agony, his eyes never leaving hers, his hand reaching out to maintain the golden tether of their bond. She remembered the southern rift. She remembered who she was. "You do not command their memory," Alara whispered, her voice growing steady, vibrating with the authority of the infinite stars. She stepped toward the phantoms, her hands glowing with a pure, blinding azure light that cut through the violet smoke. "They died for the truth. They did not die to become your puppets." She reached out and touched the spectral faces of her parents. Instead of recoiling, her cerulean magic flooded their forms, stripping away Thorn's dark corruption. The twisted expressions of hatred melted away, replaced for a single, beautiful second by the gentle, loving smiles she remembered from her childhood. They offered her a silent blessing before dissolving into particles of pure light, which flew directly into Alara's chest, supercharging her power. With a cry of defiance, Alara slammed both her palms onto the sanctuary floor. She didn't just project a memory, she unleashed the collective, unyielding will of every generation that had ever built the capital. A tidal wave of blue and silver energy erupted from her, tearing through the sanctuary, shattering the obsidian pillars, and smashing directly into Thorn's vortex. The violet flames hissed and sputtered as the stolen memories of the citizens were forcefully pulled back toward their rightful owners. Outside in the streets, the fog began to lift, and the frozen statues let out their first gasps of returned life. Inside the sanctuary, Thorn shrieked as the stolen power was violently ripped from his body, his form shrinking back to that of a withered, broken old man. But the vortex was not entirely destroyed. It was collapsing inward, threatening to detonate and take the entire palace with it. Kalen, finally breaking free of the paralysis, surged forward and grabbed Alara by the waist, shielding her with his body as the final remnant of the dark altar exploded into a blinding flash of white light. The dust of the collapsed sanctuary settled like gray snow over the ruined floorboards, but the air was finally clean. The heavy, sulfurous odor of Thorn's alchemy had vanished, replaced by the crisp, biting scent of the northern wind rushing through the shattered stained glass windows. Kalen slowly pushed himself up from the debris, his arms still wrapped protectively around Alara. His silver armor was severely dented and scorched, but the amber light in his eyes was steady, focused entirely on the woman in his arms. He asked her if she was whole, his voice rough and laced with a vulnerability he only ever showed to her. Alara nodded, her skin still faintly luminescent, reflecting the serene starlight that now filled the room. She stood up with his help, looking down at the center of the room. Advisor Thorn lay amidst the rubble, a withered, trembling shell of a man, his dark magic entirely burnt out of his veins. He was alive, but he was completely broken, staring blankly at the ceiling as the royal guards, now fully freed from their paralysis, marched into the sanctuary to drag him away to the deepest blocks of the oblivion cells. "It is over," Kalen murmured, his hand finding hers, their fingers locking together. The mate bond between them was no longer a frantic wire of survival. It had matured into a deep, resonant chord that hummed with absolute unity. The capital is breathing again. "The immediate threat is gone," Alara replied, her gaze turning toward the open window, looking out over the city below. The citizens were moving again, lights beginning to flicker on in the houses of the Grand Plaza as the unnatural fog dissolved into the night sky. "But the foundation of this kingdom is still fractured, Kalen. The people have forgotten what it means to trust their rulers. They have lived under the shadow of a lie for so long that the truth will feel blinding to them at first." Kalen stepped up beside her, his mantle of black wolf fur blowing in the wind. He agreed with her assessment. A viper's den could be cleared with steel, but a home could only be rebuilt with time and patience. He told her that the northern lords were already gathering in the lower courtyard, demanding to see their king, demanding to know the final fate of the council. But more than that, they needed to see the woman who had shattered the darkness. The kingdom needed a symbol of its rebirth. Before they descended to face the nobility, Alara walked back over to the ruined altar. There, half buried under a cracked slab of star-fallen stone, lay the leather cylinder she had carried through the war. It was completely untouched by the explosion. She picked it up, drawing out the forged decree that had cost her family their lives. With a gentle breath, she channeled a small spark of her cerulean magic into the parchment. The words did not glow with hatred this time. Instead, the forgery slowly dissolved into fine silver ash, scattering out of the window and into the mountain air. The lie was officially dead. "Let us go," Alara said, turning back to Kalen with a calm, unyielding grace. "The archives have closed the chapter on Thorn. It is time to write the first page of the new era." They walked out of the sanctuary together, their footsteps echoing through the grand corridors of the palace. As they reached the high balcony overlooking the grand courtyard, a tremendous roar rose from the thousands of gathered souls below. The northern lords stood at the front of the host, their broadswords raised in salute, while the common citizens of the capital crowded the gates, their faces illuminated by the warm glow of torches. Lord Vane of the Iron Peak stepped forward from the ranks of the nobility, his deep voice carrying across the stone plaza. He looked up at the royal couple, his eyes filled with a fierce, profound respect. "The North has survived the long winter of the Vipers." Vane shouted, his voice echoing against the palace walls. "We see our king, and we see the keeper of the light. Speak to us, your majesty. Tell us of the dawn." Kalen stepped to the edge of the balcony, his hand still firmly clasped in Alara's. He did not speak with the arrogance of a ruler who had conquered an enemy, but with the solemn gravity of a leader who had been redeemed by his people. He declared that the High Council was dismantled, their treachery exposed to the light of the ancestors. He told them that the laws of the North would no longer be written in the shadows of secret chambers but in the open sun, where every citizen could see them. "And I do not stand before you alone," Kalen's voice boomed, his alpha resonance wrapping around the crowd like a warm protective mantle. He turned slightly, bringing Alara forward so she stood directly at his side. "The crown of the North was nearly broken by deceit. It was saved by the truth and by the woman who preserved our history when I was too blind to see it. Tomorrow the sun will rise on a free kingdom, and Alara will take her rightful place as your sovereign queen." A cheer erupted from the courtyard, a sound so massive and genuine that it seemed to drive the remaining winter chill entirely from the valley. Alara looked out over the sea of faces, seeing the hope returning to the eyes of the people she had watched from the margins for 6 long years. She raised her hand, the soft, permanent light of her awakening casting a gentle, protective warmth over the entire plaza. The invisible girl from the archives was truly gone. The reign of the silent archivist and the Alpha King had officially begun, but as the crowd celebrated, Alara felt a subtle, entirely new vibration beneath her feet, a deep, ancient rhythm originating from the palace vaults below, whispering that the true history of the pack was far older and far more dangerous than anyone had ever recorded. The echoes of the celebration lingered in the mountain air long after the torches in the grand courtyard had burned down to embers. For the first time in 6 years, the capital slept under a sky untainted by the sulphurous smoke of Thorn's alchemy. Yet, within the deepest belly of the royal palace, where the foundations transitioned from smooth, polished obsidian to rough, ancient bedrock, there was no celebration. Elara walked the damp stone corridors alone, her fingers brushing the cold, weeping walls. The permanent, iridescent sheen on her skin was the only source of light in the subterranean gloom, casting a soft, ethereal blue glow over the ancient masonry. She had not been able to rest. The subtle, rhythmic thrum she had felt during the proclamation had grown stronger, a subterranean heartbeat that resonated with the very core of her newly awakened power. It was drawing her down past the oblivion cells where Thorn now sat in silence, past the deep vaults where the tax ledgers of a century were stored, to a door that did not exist on any architectural plan she had ever studied. She stopped before a massive slab of ironwood, bound in rusted bands of silver and sunk deep into the living rock. There was no keyhole, no handle, and no seal of the royal house. Instead, the wood was carved with a single colossal rune, the ancient symbol for the unspoken. "I told myself you would be asleep." A deep, resonant voice rumbled from the shadows behind her. Elara did not flinch. She turned her head slightly as Kalen stepped into the blue radiance of her aura. He had shed his heavy ceremonial armor, wearing only a simple black tunic and trousers, but his broadsword was strapped to his hip. His amber eyes were filled with a mixture of exhaustion and fierce protective alertness. The earth was whispering. "Kalen?" Elara said softly, turning back to the ironwood door. "It hasn't stopped since the vortex collapsed. Thorn didn't create the dark alchemy. He found it. He found it down here." Kalen stepped up beside her, his massive hand resting on the hilt of his blade as he surveyed the ancient door. He admitted that his grandfather had spoken of a sealed vault beneath the palace, a place where the foundational secrets of the first Alpha Pack were buried. But the royal family had been forbidden from ever opening it, told that some truths were too heavy for a crown to bear. "The crown is already heavy," Elara said, her voice carrying the absolute certainty of the sovereign of memories, "and a kingdom built on top of a hidden cage will always be unstable. We need to know what Thorn was digging for." She placed her bare palms flat against the ancient ironwood. The moment her skin touched the surface, the blue light of her gift surged violently, turning a deep electric indigo. The massive door did not swing open. Instead, the wood itself began to turn translucent, dissolving into a shimmering mist of pure memory. The illusion expanded rapidly, swallowing both Elara and Kalen until they were no longer standing in a damp corridor, but inside a vast subterranean cathedral made of white stone that had never seen the sun. In the center of the hall stood a massive crystal sarcophagus, pulsing with a pale golden light that felt exactly like Kalen's alpha aura, but infinitely more potent. Inside the crystal lay the preserved form of a massive wolf, its fur white as winter snow, its chest perfectly still. Surrounding the sarcophagus were thousands of ancient stone tablets, their surfaces covered in a frantic, jagged script. Elara stepped closer, her eyes scanning the text as her magic automatically translated the dead language. The true history of the North began to unspool before her eyes, and with every word she read, the foundation of everything she had ever believed began to crumble. "This isn't a tomb," Elara whispered, her voice trembling as she looked at the white wolf. "It's a reservoir. Kalen, your lineage, the alpha power of your family didn't evolve naturally. The first king didn't earn his crown through a blessing from the stars." Kalen moved to her side, his brow furrowed as he looked at the stone tablets. "What do they say, Elara?" She turned to him, her eyes reflecting the pale gold light of the sarcophagus. She told him that the first Alpha had committed a supreme betrayal. He had stolen the collective spiritual strength of every Omega and Beta in the original pack, binding their vitality to his own bloodline to create the supreme Alpha authority. The white wolf in the crystal was the manifestation of that stolen power, the source of the royal lineage's terrifying command. Thorn had discovered the vault and had been using his dark alchemy to tap into this ancient reservoir, draining the citizens to artificially elevate himself to the level of a god. "The entire ordering of our society," Elara said, her voice shaking with a profound historical grief. "The submission of the Omegas, the absolute rule of the Alphas, it was all engineered through a theft. Your power is an echo of their stolen lives." Kalen flinched as if he had been struck by a physical blow. He looked down at his own hands, the hands that had wielded the broadsword of the king, the hands that carried the golden tether of the fated mate bond. The realization that his very biological authority was rooted in an ancient crime against her people tore a jagged hole through his pride. The alpha wolf within him let out a low, mournful whimper, rejecting the legacy of the throne. He looked at Alara, his eyes wild with a sudden, desperate terror. He asked her if the bond between them was a lie too. If the magic that had brought them together across the ash of her village was just another mechanism of the ancient theft, meant to keep the archivist bound to the tyrant. Alara saw the brokenness in his stature, the complete collapse of the king's certainty. She stepped forward, ignoring the gold and blue energy swirling chaotically around them, and took his face in her hands. Her touch was warm, solid, and entirely free of resentment. "The throne is a lie, Kaelin," she said fiercely, her voice grounding him in the absolute present. "The history they wrote is a forgery, but this, the way your heart beats when I touch you, the way you shielded me from the fire, this is real. The stars didn't forge our bond to keep me in chains. They forged it so we could finally break them." She turned back to the crystal sarcophagus, her cerulean magic expanding until it enveloped the entire white wolf. She told him that they could not rule the new era with the stolen power of the past. To truly rebuild the North, the reservoir had to be shattered and the ancient strength had to be returned to the earth, to the people, to every Omega and Beta who had been silenced for 1,000 years. Kaelin stood beside her, his chest heaving as he processed the monumental sacrifice. Shattering the reservoir meant his own alpha power would lose its absolute terrifying dominance. He would no longer be a god among mortals, but a man among equals. He looked at Alara, seeing the sovereign queen she had become, and realized that he didn't want to be a tyrant. He wanted to be the man who deserved her. He drew his broadsword one final time, the silver steel reflecting the gold and blue twilight of the vault. Together, Kaelin whispered, his voice a solemn, unbreakable vow. They raised their hands and their steel against the foundational lie of their world, prepared to shatter the crystal and unleash a transformation that would change the face of the kingdom forever. But as Kaelin's blade began its descent toward the glass, the white wolf inside the sarcophagus suddenly opened its eyes of a pure, terrifyingly intelligent crimson that fixed directly onto Alara's soul. The crimson glare of the white wolf did not belong to a beast. It was the ancient frozen consciousness of the first king, a lingering specter of the original tyrant, who had bound the destiny of the North to a single bloodline. As Kaelin's broadsword hovered inches above the crystal sarcophagus, a shockwave of raw primordial alpha energy erupted from the crimson eyes. The force was so immense that it shattered the illusion of the subterranean cathedral, slamming Kaelin back against the ironwood door of the real vault. The ancient broadsword flew from his grip, clattering across the damp stone floor. Alara stood her ground, her boots anchored to the bedrock by the iridescent, starry light of her own power. The blue radiance of her aura flared defensively as a spectral voice, ancient and hollow like wind howling through a tomb, echoed directly inside her mind. "You dare dismantle the architecture of the gods, little archivist?" The voice hissed, vibrating with 1,000 years of accumulated arrogance. "Without the theft, there is no kingdom. Without the absolute rule of the Alpha, the North will tear itself apart in the winter dark. I did not enslave the weak, I preserved the whole." "You built a palace out of cages," Alara retorted aloud, her voice ringing clear against the ancient bedrock. She stepped closer to the sarcophagus, the crimson light lashing out at her skin like tongues of fire, but the blue light of her memories absorbed the heat. "A kingdom that requires the silence of its people to survive is not preserved, it is already dead." Kaelin forced himself back to his feet, his muscles screaming against the primordial pressure. The alpha wolf within him was being ordered to submit by the very source of its lineage, but Kaelin fought his own biology. He looked at Alara, whose skin was blazing with the light of 1,000 returned truths, and he chose his mate over his bloodline. He lunged forward, grabbing his fallen sword and driving the silver blade down with all his remaining strength. "I am a king of the living," Kaelin roared, his voice breaking through the ancient command, "not a guardian of your crimes." The silver broadsword struck the crystal sarcophagus with a deafening metallic ring. The blade shattered into a dozen fragments, but a thin hairline fracture appeared across the golden glass. From that single crack, a terrifying pressure began to leak. The stolen vitality of 1,000 years, the compressed grief, the stifled power, the stolen strength of every Omega and Beta who had ever lived and died in the shadows began to hiss into the chamber like steam. The crimson eyes of the first king flared with panicked rage. The spectral form of the tyrant rose from the crystal, a massive shadowy wolf with jaws wide enough to swallow the room, lunging directly at Kaelin to repossess the bloodline. Alara didn't hesitate. She threw herself between Kaelin and the shadow, opening her arms wide. She did not use her magic as a shield this time. She used herself as a channel. She commanded the leaking reservoir to flow through her, acting as the bridge between the ancient theft and the present generation. The physical toll was catastrophic. Alara's vision went entirely blue, her veins turning a dark electric indigo against her luminous skin. She could feel the weight of every suppressed voice in Northern history tearing through her spirit, a symphony of a million tears and broken promises. Her knees buckled, and she would have been torn to pieces by the sheer volume of the power if Kaelin hadn't caught her from behind. The Alpha King wrapped his arms around her waist, anchoring her to his chest. He did not try to stop the power. Instead, he opened his own soul through the mate bond, letting the torrent of ancient grief flow through him as well. He shared the agony of her people, letting the golden light of his authority mix with the blue light of her truth. The bond between them, once a line of fire, became a vast tranquil river that stabilized the chaotic energy. Together, they redirected the torrent. Alara pointed her glowing hands toward the ceiling of the vault, toward the foundations of the palace and the streets of the capital above. "Go back," she whispered, her voice carrying the collective weight of the ancestors. "Return to the earth. Return to the people." The blue and gold energy erupted from her palms in a massive pillar of light that tore straight through the bedrock, bypassing the stone walls of the palace and shooting high into the night sky. The explosion of magic did not damage a single stone of the capital. Instead, it fell back over the entire kingdom like a warm, silent rain of starlight. Across the city and across the far-reaching provinces of the north, thousands of Omegas and Betas woke from their sleep as the starlight touched their skin. They didn't gain a destructive, violent power. Instead, a deep, long-buried vitality surged back into their blood. The invisible chains of biological submission that had weighed down their spirits for a millennium simply dissolved. The air grew lighter, the winter chill softened, and a profound collective sigh of relief echoed across the land. Inside the vault, the shadowy wolf of the first king let out a final fading howl of defeat as its reservoir emptied entirely. The crimson light in the crystal sarcophagus sputtered and went out, leaving the white fur of the ancient beast to crumble into harmless gray dust. The cavernous room fell into a deep, absolute silence. Alara collapsed back against Kaelin's chest, her skin losing its blinding luminescence, returning to a soft, natural warmth. The primordial alpha pressure that had defined Kaelin's entire existence had vanished. The terrifying, commanding aura was gone. He was no longer a god among his subjects. He lowered his head into the crook of her neck. His breathing ragged, his body trembling from the monumental shift, he asked her in a quiet, trembling whisper if he was still the man she chose. Alara turned in his arms, her fingers gently tracing the rugged lines of his face, her eyes shining with a deep, unbreakable love. She told him that he was finally free. He was no longer the bearer of a stolen crown. He was the first true leader of a free people. But as they stood in the ruins of the ancient vault, the ironwood door behind them creaked open. Lord Vane stood in the threshold, his face pale, holding a torch that flickered wildly in the new lighter air of the subterranean tunnels. He looked at the shattered sarcophagus, then at the royal couple, his voice filled with an entirely new kind of awe. "Your Majesty," Vane breathed, dropping to one knee, not out of a biological urge to submit, but out of genuine, unforced loyalty. "The city, the people, something has changed in the wind. The council cells are open, Thorn is gone, and he did not flee alone. He has taken the ancient map of the eastern wilds. The final dawn of the Northern Revolution did not break with the harsh iron-gray cold of the past. As Alara and Kaelin ascended from the subterranean vaults to the highest balcony of the royal keep, they found the capital bathed in a soft, golden warmth that felt entirely new. The sky was clear, a vast expanse of pale blue that seemed to expand infinitely over the mountain peaks. Below them, the city was alive. The citizens were not cowering in their homes, nor were they standing in frozen submissive silence. They were gathering in the grand plaza by the thousands, their voices rising in a vibrant, chaotic symphony of shared community. The invisible weight that had pressed down on the chests of every Omega and Beta for a millennium had evaporated, replaced by a profound, wide-awake clarity. Kaelin stood at the marble balustrade, his hands resting lightly on the stone. He wore no armor, no heavy wolf fur mantle, and no crown. His simple black tunic bore no royal sigils, yet as he looked down at his people, his posture was more commanding than it had ever been. The terrifying biological alpha aura that used to force men to their knees was gone, replaced by the genuine, unyielding presence of a leader who had bled for his people. He looked at his hands, feeling the steady, healthy rhythm of his own pulse. He was no longer a god driven by a stolen lineage. He was a man who had chosen honor over an empire of chains. Alara stepped up beside him, her fingers sliding into his, their palms meeting in a perfect anchoring warmth. The permanent iridescent sheen of her awakening had softened into a gentle natural radiance that caught the morning light like dew on winter grass. The leather cylinder that had carried the weight of her past was gone, replaced by a small obsidian ledger she had bound herself, the first volume of the new archives. "The lords are reorganizing the guard," Kalen said softly, his voice a rich, calm rumble that no longer carried the sharp edge of territorial dominance. "Without the forced submission, some of the traditionalists are terrified. They don't know how to command men who have the freedom to say no. Then they will learn to inspire them instead," Alara replied, her gaze tracking a flock of birds flying freely across the open plaza. "True loyalty cannot be bred in a laboratory or forged with dark alchemy, Kalen. It has to be earned in the light." Lord Vane stepped out onto the balcony, his heavy boots clicking against the marble. The old warlord looked tired, his face lined with the stress of a sleepless night, but his eyes were bright with a fierce, unforced respect. He held a weathered leather scroll case in his hand, stopping a respectful distance from the couple. "The Eastern Border Patrols have confirmed the tracks," Vane reported, his voice dropping to a somber pitch. Thorne's remaining acolytes managed to break him out during the spiritual shift. They crossed the Iron Ridge before the vanguard could secure the pass. He has the map of the Eastern Wilds, and he is heading toward the uncharted territories of the Blood Pact clans. Kalen didn't growl. He didn't let out the feral fury of a threatened predator. He merely nodded, his jaw tightening with a cold, focused resolve. "Thorne is a shadow without a source, now, Vane. The reservoir is gone. The alchemy he used to control the Silent Ones has no power over people who have reclaimed their own spirits. He will try to rebuild, sire," Vane warned, looking down at the crowd below. "The clans in the East do not follow our laws. They are wild, fractured, and hungry for power. If Thorne offers them the remnants of his knowledge, then we will be ready," Alara cut in, her voice ringing with the absolute authority of the sovereign of memories. She raised the obsidian ledger, her eyes locking onto Vane's. "The archives are no longer a graveyard for forgotten crimes, Lan Chua Vane. They are the blueprint for our defense. We know every method Thorne used, every compound he mixed, and every lie he told. He can run to the edge of the world, but the truth will outrun him." Vane looked at Alara, then at Kalen, and for the first time in his life, the battle-hardened alpha smiled without a trace of cynicism. He bowed his head, a gesture of pure conscious fealty, before turning back to the interior to marshal the new volunteer guard. As the sun rose higher, casting long golden shadows across the stone plaza, Kalen turned Alara to face him. He reached up, his calloused thumb gently tracing the line of her jaw, his amber eyes reflecting the infinite depth of the pale blue sky. The mate bond between them was no longer a chaotic wire of survival or a product of the first king's engineered destiny. It was a clean, quiet hearth fire, a mutual choice renewed with every breath they took together. "6 years ago, I looked at the archives and saw nothing but paper," Kalen whispered, his forehead leaning gently against hers. "I thought a king's duty was to hold the sword. I didn't know that the heaviest thing in the world was the silence of the woman I was meant to love." "The silence is over, Kalen," Alara murmured, her hands resting flat against his chest, feeling the steady, honest beat of his heart. "We have torn down the old cathedral of shadows. Now we build a house out of the truth." Below them, the crowd in the plaza caught sight of the two figures standing together on the high balcony. A massive, spontaneous cheer rose from the thousands of gathered souls, not a roar of terrified submission, but a joyous, chaotic explosion of a free people celebrating their dawn. They did not demand a crown, and they did not beg for mercy. They looked up at the king and the archivist as equals ready to march into an uncertain future. Thorne was still out there in the dark of the Eastern Wilds, and the fractured clans would undoubtedly bring a new kind of war to their doorstep. But as Alara looked out over the transformed kingdom, her hand firmly locked in Kalen's, she knew that the long winter of the North had finally broken. The history of the Pact was no longer a tool for tyrants. It was a living, breathing promise written by the people themselves. The story of the Silent Archivist and the Alpha King had ended, and the Chronicle of the Free North had officially begun. Disclaimer: this video is a work of fiction, created with the assistance of artificial intelligence. All characters, settings, and events depicted are entirely imaginary and are not intended to represent real-life people or situations. Please view for entertainment purposes only.